Thank you all and welcome you. My name is Lawrence Sullivan and I direct the Center for the Study of World Religions. I'm a faculty member here at Harvard Divinity School, and we've actually put together a series of programs during this spring examining issues of being stewards of the sacred and what it involves, especially on the part of museums, to handle sacred artifacts and objects that are part of the religious life of peoples. Some time ago, about 2 years ago, I think, we were hosted, our center and its staff and some of us that were doing research on this issue were hosted at the Smithsonian at the National Museum of the American Indian, where we had a chance to meet several of the guests who've reciprocated now and allowed themselves to be guests here of ours, so we want to welcome everyone. I also want to thank very much the director of the Peabody Museum here at Harvard University, Rubie Watson, for joining our panel, and I'll let the people who come after me give the introductions to give you background on the people who are participating, but just at least thank Terry Snowball, and Gary Roybal, and Peter Jemison, and Bruce Bernstein, Jim Pepper Henry, and Rubie Watson also. And I want to make a special word of thanks to Allison Edwards, who has put this program together. In fact, at this point I'll turn the mic over to Allison and we can get the program to begin.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the second of our colloquia series in 2001, Stewards of the Sacred, that opened with a conference for museum directors keynoted by Richard West, who's the director of the Museum of the American Indian Smithsonian. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Bruce Bernstein, the chair of this panel, and to welcome you here after studying your work for 2 years. And it's just a great pleasure. Bruce Bernstein is the Assistant Director for Cultural Resources at the National Museum of the American Indian. Prior to his arrival, Bernstein served as Chief Curator and then Director at the Museum of Indian Arts and Cultural Laboratory of Anthropology in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Before that, he served as Assistant Director of Santa Fe's Wheelwright Museum of the American Indian. His scholarly background includes a PhD in anthropology from the University of New Mexico, where he studied under the renowned native scholar Alfonso Ortiz.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much. What we're going to do, as far as the format tonight, is each of us have about 5 minutes to present our point of view on the subject of beyond repatriation and tell you something about what we think that is. We've talked briefly about it, all of us, but I assure you that each one of us individually has thought very deeply about that subject matter. And I'll introduce each panelist as we go along on that. Now, the reason why we look at, and I'll use NAGPRA and repatriation probably interchangeably. Very undisciplined, my apologies. But they're one and the same in terms of this discussion. I like to think about that first decade of NAGPRA, or the repatriation decade, which was the 1990s. And here we are at the end of just about 10 years. And we have another 10 years. And one of the things the panelists will also focus on is what was the aspirations for NAGPRA and repatriation at 1990, what happened during the 1990s, and then what are the realities that we're sitting in now, and what are then their aspirations for the next 10 years. So those are the things that I'd like to take on. Now, people say about NAGPRA some incredible things. One person has said that it's arguably the most important museum legislation in American history. Another individual, who just happens to be my boss, says that NAGPRA has fundamentally changed the nature of museums. And those are two things that I'd also like to discuss here. Now, NAGPRA itself, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was passed in 1990. And its intent was to return to Native peoples human remains, funerary objects, both associated and unassociated, objects of cultural patrimony, and sacred or ritual objects. And throughout the decade, it took until about 1998 to figure out what each of those definitions meant, what a tribe was, how that would be looked at as well. And there's still a lot of controversy around that. The other observation I'd make about NAGPRA is that there's a large industry built around NAGPRA now, which I find very interesting. And there are people who make their livelihood off of that, making reports for museums, working for tribes, and so forth. And so one of the things that we'll talk about here is some of that apparatus as well. Now, the law mandated museums make inventories. And in 1995, museums were supposed to be done with these inventories. And these are long, often in museums, these were long neglected collections. So it should have been a very nice thing that this law really forced museums to take stock of their collections and act in a more responsible way. The other thing that NAGPRA did was it put them in direct contact with Native people. If you think for a moment, if museums are about knowledge and the gathering and then interpretation of knowledge, what could be better than to have Native people come in and tell us about the collections so we would do better jobs as interpreters? So those are the types of things that it was supposed to do. The other distinction I want you to think about tonight is about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. There is a letter of the law, which is that inventory in 1995. You send a letter off to the tribe, they come and you consult and you figure out what to do. There is a spirit of the law, which I'm much more interested in, and that has to do with the empowerment and the inclusion of Native people. And I think all of the panelists tonight, who are carefully hand-chosen, will speak about the same as well. Now, repatriation and the coming home is not a new issue, and it didn't pop up in 1990, but it's a continuing part of Native people's lives, particularly in the 20th century, after long years of genocide and warfare with Europeans. And that repatriation coming home is about language, it's about land, it's about self-determination, government. So if you look then at NAGPRA, it's just one of many pieces of repatriation coming home for Native people. It's a long time coming. It wasn't something that just popped up out of the blue. The example from the 1970s of that is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed in 1978, as well as some of the Nixon administration's self-determination policies. So it's seen this way. We understand NAGPRA as part of a much broader road. And if you see this way and you think about the spirit of those things, it's about dignity, it's about ethics, and it's about that empowerment and inclusion of Native people in determining their own lives and their own futures and what people say about them. Now, in order for NAGPRA to work right, then in my opinion, it cannot be defined as a relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, but must transcend that in some fashion. NAGPRA then is about the building of partnerships. And let me tell you what I mean by that. In the language of museums work these days, we use three words. We use consultation, we use collaboration, and we use partnerships. Now, consultation is something you pay someone $125, they come in, they tell you what they think, they go home, you never have to talk to them again. Consultation is the easy way out. Collaboration, you're building things together, but again, it's a little cost a little bit more money perhaps, and a little longer relationships, and it's certainly getting along the right place. But partnership, that long-term partnership, the building of a relationship that is long-term is really what NAGPRA is about. Now, the idea of repatriation then, and the concept of empowerment and inclusion of Native people is that repatriation is the slimmest used or least used solution to Native concerns about collections in museums. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, in our collections we have 1,900 pieces from Cheyenne people, Northern Cheyenne people. Now, Cheyenne people will come and they'll look at those collections, and there is a potential that they'll ask for nothing to be returned to them. There's a potential they'll ask for one thing, or 100 things, or 200 things. Now, that still leaves us with over 1,000 items in the collection, maybe close to 1,900 objects. So what is our relation, what is our ongoing relationship then with Cheyenne people and the care of those collections? At NMAI, we talk not about ownership of collections, but we consider ourselves to be the custodian or stewards of these collections. And that's a very important change of mind in terms of getting direction from Native people in terms of how we should think about those things. Now, one of the things we had a brief talk this afternoon with one of the sections from one of the courses here at Harvard. And one of the things that I talk to people about was the perspective that we see things from. If you think for a moment about NAGPRA and what it's about, we think about the object. If this is the object of return, and NAGPRA is about writing that long report that details the acquisition history as if it's an isolate that that object has been in the museum all that time. It doesn't take in consideration all the other things before and after the museum has had possession of that object. And we're always looking at it from this perspective, from the museum perspective. And what I think we need to do in NAGPRA is begin to look at things from the orientation of the communities. And I think that's the challenge for us, is begin to listen to what community members say and begin to understand what they see about these objects that we have in the collections. I also wanted just to introduce the subject of secrecy. And Alice and I were talking at lunchtime about the nature of secrecy. If you think about secrecy in Anglo-American society, you begin to understand that there's only one place where it's acceptable, and that has to do with national security. Otherwise, there's no place for secrecy in our society. You can come here to university, and you can be from any background, you can learn anything you want. The libraries hold that information. It just doesn't work the same way in native cultures. You're born to information. According to your background and things that happen to you during your lifetime, you begin to have access to that information. So not every native person automatically knows everything or can possibly know everything. So therefore, how can a museum hold an object and expect to know everything or have access to all the knowledge about that object is? We must find ourselves in relationships and partnerships with the proper people and communities who have those types of knowledge. Now, NAGPRA work continues to be segmented or segregated off from the rest of museum work. It's lodged in special departments, and what I mean by this is that the funding has allowed a lot of inventories of collections, but I really wonder about the worldviews of Native people and how they've been incorporated into the day-to-day work of museums. Certainly we have Native people's views and Native people involved in advisory boards, in exhibitions, and in public programs, but I wonder about our collections policies and procedures. Where does the work of NAGPRA and repatriation begin to show up in those areas? That's another concern of mine. And how then does how do our collection policies and procedures begin to encompass the spiritual needs that arise from these objects? And I think those are important considerations for us to think about. Now, one of the last thing I just wanted to cover, just about what about these objects that get left behind, and what about these partnerships that we're talking about, and how do we build these partnerships around these objects? I've told you that at NMAI that we consider ourselves to be the stewards, or custodians for these collections. We don't consider ourselves owners of those collections, and we're always seeking those partnerships of bringing people in, seeking people out, in an effort that I like to term as inreach. If you think about museums often talk about their outreach, that we're going to outreach to communities. Well, for a place like NMAI, we're really about inreach. Native people, we need Native people in order to exist, to help tell us what we need to do with those collections. That then brings up the point of what every person on staff represents, and that is as a facilitator or advocate. Native or non-Native on the staff, everybody has that role, because the assumptions that we work under at NMAI is that the expertise resides in the communities, and secondly, that that our work is not the development of new systems of knowledge, but the uncovering of existing systems of knowledge. So those are very important things. Now we're dealing with those issues. Let me tell you just about two things very quickly. We're dealing with those issues in our collections database, our catalog records. If you think about what that represents, you have a catalog record and you have basically a card or a screen or several different screens. But what does that tell you about the object? How do you ideationalize that particular record so it has a relevance and ongoing relevance to Native peoples? And those are one of the things. And how does it then affect our constituents in its use? And then how does it, in turn, affect our audiences in its use of the same database? Those are the types of questions we're asking ourselves. And then in exhibitions. Exhibitions is a big place for that. And developing partnerships with communities is challenging. It's time-consuming. We're under the gun to have schedules and meet budgets and schedules, and that's often very, very difficult at times. But what does it mean to go back to a community, to sit down and listen to a community, and then once that community has told us what to do or suggested what we can do about certain subject matters, to go back and vet that again with the community, to bring it back and then do schematic design and go back to the community again? Are museums built for that type of apparatus to go back and forth like that? If you think, too, about the way that native voice has been used in exhibitions, it's very important to consider that a lot of quotations have often been used, but that means the person writing, like in any other paper, people using the quotations still have agency over those quotations or power over those quotations. We must dislodge the power and put the power back into native communities in order that we understand more about native people and their concerns through our exhibitions and programs. Those are some of the concerns that I see as beyond repatriation. That repatriation is just the very entrance for those sets of concerns. Each individual has some prepared things to say, and the format, we're trying to keep it down to 5 or so minutes each. And then and then there'll be a lot of time for questions and discussion. Our first speaker is Terry Snowball, who's a Wisconsin Ho-Chunk Potawatomi man. He's been with the museum about 4 years. He works in collections management. Terry is a graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Terry works in collections management. I mean, he does the integrated pest management, and he looks at the environmental conditions. He also works a great deal in repatriation, helping to return objects, actually doing the returns, building the containers in which objects and remains are returned, as well as assisting Native people when they come, who provide us with information how to care for collections. Terry?
I'll be clapping for Bruce. Well, I just want to start with citing this statement that was made, a passage by Bandelier, and what it's in reference to is about the human experiences and how they relate to the origins of stories and myths and the basis of the religious beliefs and the covenants that are there within these, or that aren't there, that we're kind of returning back to these tribes in restoration and correcting some of the legacies of the past. So in that sense, we have that responsibility, and that's another kind of role that we're assuming with this. But it basically, we'll have to read it. It says, regardless of what Indians have said concerning their origins, their migration, their experiences with birds, animals, land, waters, mountain, and other peoples, the scientists have maintained a stranglehold on the definitions of what respectable and reliable human experiences are. Indian explanation is always cast aside as a superstition precluding Indians from having an acceptable status as human beings and simply take whatever status they have been granted by scientists at that point at which they have become acceptable to science. The stereotypical image of American Indians as childlike, superstitious creatures still remains in the popular American mind. As subhuman species, that really has no feelings, values, or inherent worth. This attitude permeates American society because Americans have been taught that scientists are always right, that they have no personal biases, and they do not lie. 3 fictions that are impossible to defeat. Now, I don't mean to be inciting riot by that, but I think I'm taking a softer approach to that, I hope you know. But basically, the scientific approach is just that, and what we're doing with the relationships that we have established and that are ongoing is that we really rely on the human experiences. And being Native people ourselves, we deal a lot with that personal relationship within our own communities and having those traditions and those beliefs. Coming to the museums, we're really presented with sort of a total contradiction to the nature of how we are generally perceiving those things to be in our own communities. And by that I mean talking about the same thing. Sorry about that, Bruce. Talking about the same thing about the object. The sense of it is that, I was talking earlier with Larry about it, is that those things do represent a balance within those communities. And whatever processes that were there, that were managed to alienate these things from these people, the separation has has considerable impact on those communities. It's been very derisive in its impacts. And so what we have to do in our charge with those objects as being the stewards is, in one sense, reestablish what those contexts are. And that's part of the program that we work with traditional care. Because we can't necessarily or exactly affect that kind of practice or treatment to these things, because we're not the appropriate caretakers of that. But we have to incense people with the understanding of what that relationship is. One of the programs that we are instituting within our museum, and particularly at this time of the complete upheaval of our collections, we're moving over 800,000 objects from the Bronx to Washington, D.C. And with that, in that sense, I think you can imagine that kind of migration has some kinds of secular implications with that kind of transferal, but we can't exactly exact that, and it's very difficult in that sense. But getting back to part of what we've done in terms of recognizing the nature of a collection and its balance is we use the services of traditional and spiritual people that are representatives of a given community to exact that kind of exchange with the staff, both native and non-native, and that's in part not in any sense related to repatriation, but again it is, because we're recognizing that there's that spiritual platform that's there, that's part of repatriation. So with that comes the exchange. A face is given to the collection in terms of who these people are, and as it being a living and breathing thing, in terms of the religion itself and the objects, because they're equated to have a life, and I strongly believe in that, and I don't consider myself very superstitious. But so in that sense, what we're doing with that role and that responsibility is really giving a different sense of what those relationships are with Native people, and it's working to the degree that we understand our role more comprehensively. But I'm going to break off and start talking about repatriation and what that has held for me in terms of getting into those exclusive areas of dealing with extremely sensitive materials and developing these very intense relationships or exchanges with the process and that are related to the returns and affecting the kind of care that's needed for those things. I've been in very tenuous moments with these situations because of the fact, the degree of seriousness with this that's implicated with the relationship once you see it, the interaction with the religious articles that are returned. In one case, one gentleman we happened to return back a mask to the Tlingits. They hadn't ever seen this mask in person, and only in pictures, and had been alienated from them at least a few generations, and it dated back to the 1800s, and sometime in the 1800s. I'm bad with facts. But, and so this gentleman came to the facility and really couldn't ponder the fact, or he couldn't come to terms with the fact that that was becoming a reality for them. So almost a state of losing composure with that fact, and really presents the whole issue for me in terms of what it means to bring those things back to people. I drew on a little analogy of using talking to Larry again. This idea of the game, a toy game, I'm sure you're familiar with it, where you're removing these sticks from this vessel that contains these marbles. Well, if you can look at the Indian community as just being, in that respect, Indian cultures and what's happened to this country, little by little, all those things mean different things. They're, in effect, smallpox, genocide, alienation of these spiritual materials, to eventually getting to the point where everything falls away, and only a few things, maybe a few marbles, a few cultures, if you will, are exactly, I should say, maybe within a community. Let's bring it a little closer to home. Having all of those kinds of things fall away, the people falling away from what's held those things together, and then having what's on the bottom, in the contemporary sense, Indian people are sort of in that situation with their relationship to these things. And the secular material is still holding those things, and there's probably a few people, I think nowadays, that are holding that together. And what was taken away in the sense of that object was the language, was the beliefs, was the stories, was the myths, were the traditions, the creativity. So it's an impossible thing to contend with in terms of how do you bring that back together. Well, I don't necessarily know if you can, but taking some of those things that were taken away and putting them back into position sort of helps establish again the foundations for it, and so that those things that are there can be somewhat stabilized, and eventually, hopefully, maybe to propagate and grow again. But it's a timeline that's very, very short in terms of Indian people, because of all the other kinds of things that are imposing themselves in the world, and we do exist in this world, not only as Indian people, but holding down a job and things like that. But I think in that sense, we as a museum have been changing those kinds of issues and setting a type of precedent that really puts in motion a whole different thought. But there again, too, I think there's this fear of these kinds of things being taken away from the institutions. What's the institution really losing in that sense? That there's no sense of equation for me in terms of what it brings back to these people. So I'm not really sure. I think there is a fair exchange that goes on with that, because someday in that regard, maybe as an institution, or as institutions or agencies, will come to understand or appreciate those cultures in that regard. But that's a whole other area to go off on when it comes to people and developing their own sovereignty for themselves as far as Indian people go. And that's going to be a never-ending issue, and this is just part of the equation. But I think I'm done for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. That was about 5 minutes. Our next speaker is Gary Roybal. Gary is from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, which is just north of Santa Fe. Gary is the curator at the Bandelier National Monument. Bandelier is both a national monument that depicts what they call archaeological sites, as well as the ancestral home of Gary's own community. Gary's been in museums for well over 20 years, having gone also to the Institute of American Indian Arts, and then studying also School of American Research, developing and implementing his a tribal museum in his own community. He also worked at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and has been with Bandelier 12 years. Gary?
First of all, thank you for inviting myself and other panelists tonight to talk to you about NAGPRA and other issues. But I'd like to ask all of you in the audience, how many of you have ever been to Bandelier? Okay, I don't need to say anything then, right? No. No. Thank you for being able to go down to my part of the country. I believe that's what we say in our country, that's God's country, because we have such beautiful sunsets every day and blue skies. A lot of sunshine. 300 plus days out of the year we have sunshine. Like Bruce had mentioned, I've worked with Bandelier for now almost 12 years, and I live only half an hour away from Bandelier at my home village of San Ildefonso. I was born and raised there, and fluent in my Tewa language, and have been also a former lieutenant governor 3 terms over the past years, and working in tribal administration, tribal government. And it gives me a sort of a perspective that a lot of people don't have, and looking at from the tribal point and also now from the museum point of view, and being a Native American, working in collections, and have seen over the past number of years what museums have gone through in terms of changes that have occurred, not only because of NAGPRA, but because of how people have viewed collections and how they want to manage the collections. And I've been part of that. But give you an idea of Bandelier and the ones that have never been there, and I hope after this presentation that you take the time when you're on your vacation, if you ever get to New Mexico, to go to Bandelier. I will show you a couple slides. When it's going to work. I tried. Where would it be? Okay, Bandelier is located about 50 miles north of Albuquerque, about 2 hours drive from Albuquerque, and it's about 10 miles from Los Alamos and White Rock, New Mexico, and we have about 32,000 acres at the foot of the Jemez Mountains. And the area that you see here is called Frijoles Canyon. And that's where the main part of the ruins are located. We have the large village of, which is called in Caris, Divinity. And this area was occupied between AD 1200 to about mid-1500s. From here, they went down to either the Pueblo Cochiti, which is the Caris-speaking group, or my home village of the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, which is a Tewa-speaking group. Both villages are somehow sister villages considered today because of their cultural and religious ties with each other. But within the monument, within about 1990 on up to about 1995, we had about 42% of the total area within the monument that was surveyed of some of the arc sites and shrines and what have you, and about 2,400 sites have been identified so far. But that's within just the boundaries of the park. So there's a lot more areas out of the park that belongs to the National Forest Service, DOE, Los Alamos, as well as the Pueblo of San Alfonso and Cochiti. And there are many sites, but we have quite a few canyons. Like you said, there's Alamo Canyon, Kaplan Canyon, and Frijoles Canyon, between 400 to maybe 600 feet deep, and they're very large canyons. And this is the entrance to the Vista Center within the park. This building that you see, along with there's about 31 historic buildings that were built during the Civil Conservation Corps in the 1930s, and this is what is considered now a historic district, because these are one of the only largest group of historic structures that were built by the CCC group during that period. And the area that you would see within Frijoles Canyon is those prehistoric sites, buildings that were built on the north face of the cliff, and they're all volcanic tuff, built by mud plaster, and maybe in some places 2 or 3 story high. And this is what is called longhouse. And these areas were the ruins were built against the wall in the north face, where the solar heat was very important to heating during the winter time. And this is Bandelier black and gray, that was about 1400s. This is I think, let's see. Oh, can do that. Oh, there you go. This is Sankowi black and gray. Sankowi is a Tewa village about 10 miles from Frijoles Canyon, and part of San Alfonso. The Tewa is an ancestral site. Is another Bandelier black and gray jar. And this is a Cochiti dough bowl that's more recent, in about 1960s. That's part of our collections. And this is some of Maria and Julian Martinez pottery, as well as their son Popovida, that we have on exhibit within the museum. And within our collection also we have ethnographic material. This is Pablita Velarde's painting. She's from Santa Clara, Pueblo. And she did about 76 original paintings depicting the daily lives of the Pueblo people. And that's one of the largest collections of her works produced by her for Bandelier. She was commissioned by the National Park Service under the WPA program to do these paintings for us, and we now have them in our collection. So this one was done in, part of them were in watercolor and casein. On the figurines that you see in the background, these are what we call stone lions that were made by the Pueblo people who live in Bandelier about maybe 1400s. They were cast out of the stone, and this is a shrine. The mountain lions represent to the Pueblo people strength and agility and cunning. And the Pueblo people will go and make a pilgrimage about 6 miles away from the main Frijoles Canyon headquarters. And they would go and pray and throw cornmeal on the shrine to ask the spirit of the stone lions to help them be good hunters like themselves. And I'll go a little bit more detail on some aspect of the stone lines in a few minutes. And this is the Pueblo of Cochiti and the plaza of the Pueblo. And this is like prehistoric times in Bandelier and today in the communities. The plaza is very important because many of the ceremonial dances and other religious activities are performed. And like the Pueblo of Cochiti and most of the southern Caras Pueblos, when they do perform certain ceremonies, non-Indians are not allowed to see many of the ceremonies, only for the people who live within the community or who are married in the community. Even I myself, who is a non-member of the community, can't go in at certain times as well. Cool. That's it. Yeah. I just wanted to show you a little bit about Bandelier because NAGPRA has been part of, I've been working at Bandelier, like I said, for a number of years, but since 1990, and 1993 I should say, I've been involved with repatriation efforts at Bandelier. I did all the summaries and inventory reports for the park. In 1995, we were the first National Park Service unit in all of the national park units in the United States to have done a first major repatriation of 48 human remains and 10 associated funeral objects that were reburied within the park boundaries. And again in 1998, we repatriated 53 sacred objects to the Pueblo of Cochiti. In 1999, 2 human remains were transferred to the Corps of Engineers Albuquerque District because we had them in our collections, but because of where they were excavated within the Cochiti Dam project. They had the responsibility of working with the Cochiti Pueblo to repatriate through their efforts, not through Bandelier. Reason I'm bringing that idea up is because prior to 1990, and maybe 1970s and 80s, the National Park Service at Bandelier has really never had any close relationships with the Pueblo groups until NAGPRA came along. I guess in some sense, the law made it to a point where it had mandated to make those relationships happen. But it was a good thing for the park and a good thing for the tribal groups. We have 19 Pueblos in New Mexico, and during our consultations in 95, 96, and 98, out of those 19, it was sort of like a self-elimination where only 6 Pueblos were involved with very close consultations for our repatriation. They themselves told us, we have ancestral ties to Bandelier. The Park Service didn't have to do that. The Pueblos of San Alfonso, my home village, Santa Clara, Cochiti, San Felipe, Santo Domingo, and Zuni are the main players in dealing with repatriation efforts at Bandelier. The other part of it is that the park superintendent, along with the staff, fully supported our efforts in working with the tribal groups in order for the repatriations to happen. I think if we didn't have full support from our park superintendent as well as our regional staff, a lot of those things wouldn't have happened. Like I said, during the time that we were doing our repatriations at Bandelier, we were considered a pilot project. Other parks were looking at Bandelier and looking at how we were doing our consultations, how we were doing our letters or repatriation agreements or reports. And after our repatriations were done, they were calling us to give them examples of how they should proceed with their repatriations as well. And just a few months ago, about 4 months ago, I worked with the curator from Selena's mission in southern New Mexico to work with them in repatriating human remains as well. And they repatriated close to 1,000 remains to put back into the ground. So I had a little hand in helping them to facilitate reboxing and being able to work through their Park Service area as well as tribal groups to repatriate those items. So we were able to help other parks as well in dealing with the repatriation efforts. And one slide I showed you in the Shrine of the Stone Lines. Back in about 1992 and 93, prior to that, we had a problem where a lot of deer antlers, deer antlers, crystals, owl feathers, and sherds were left at the site. And the superintendent, myself, and others went out to go see the site, and it started looking very trashy. And we consulted with the public coach, the tribal leaders and religious leaders went out on horseback to look at the site. And they themselves made the determination of cleaning the site, of getting rid of so-called foreign objects. As far as they were concerned, the only objects that should be left are cornmeal and corn pollen and footprints. And that's what we did. And today, the tribal officials, tribal rangers, as well as our park police protection staff go out periodically to make sure that there's nothing else left at the site. And we have that sort of agreement, gentleman's agreement, nothing in writing, but we do that because of the relationship that we built with Coach D. Based upon our consultation efforts during the NAGPRA, the consultation has kept on going up to today, and we have a Bandelier Tribal Consultation Committee made out of the 6 pueblos. And not only we have dealt with NAGPRA, now we're going into park management issues. Includes sitting down with the 6 pueblos and their representatives and helping us to plan projects and programs. And Bruce talked about partnership, and that's how we look at that, building that partnership for now and the future, because it also brings about helping the park understand the Pueblo's point of view, as well as employment for Pueblo people, training opportunities, and whatever it takes in the future. And we're building upon that and making each other comfortable in working with each other and saying Bandelier is not only for the general public to come and see, but also in turn the Pueblo people feel comfortable going up to Bandelier and say, this is my ancestral site. We want to come up here. We want to be part of the management of the park. And being a tribal official from the past has helped the tribal groups themselves, because I understand where they're coming from, because being a tribal leader, I was on the other side, working with the Park Service, working with Forest Service. And now I'm a park employee, and I can talk to the superintendent and give them a recommendation how we should deal with certain issues that the Pueblos themselves are bringing to us. Give them my recommendation, and that has helped a lot. But like I said, the park has made it itself open to criticism, good or bad, and we have a new superintendent at the park now as well. and maybe some of you have heard that just in May of last year we had a big fire. It was called the Sierra Grande fire. Before that, we had a Dome fire, very close. And in 1977, we had the La Mesa fire. And the biggest fire that we had, like I said, was Sierra Grande, and about 44,000 acres was burned, part of Los Alamos community. That's about 12 miles away from Bandelier. Quite a few houses were burned. But right now, we're trying to heal ourselves as park employees, as well as working with the community of Los Alamos to also heal the relationship between the community and Bandelier. And we're doing that. But okay. One last thing, like I said, over the years we've had a proactive approach in repatriation, and I think because the example I gave you of doing the repatriation, that proactive approach has made it possible to be successful in doing our repatriation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Our next speaker is Jim Pepper Henry, who's the repatriation manager at the National Museum of the American Indian. Jim is of Kaw, Muskogee, and Creek descent, and has been with the museum since 1998. Prior to that, he was the director of the Kanza Museum in Kaw, Oklahoma, as well as in Portland and Alaska in museum jobs as well. Jim is also a good double for Neil Diamond. Thank you.
Love on the rocks. No, never mind. I have some slides to show you. We can go ahead and get going. I've been with the National Museum of the American Indian for 3 years now. And before I came on board, I worked for the Kaw Nation of Oklahoma, which is my tribe. And I was the repatriation manager there. And in 1996 and 97, the Kaw Nation actually filed a dispute with the Smithsonian involving the repatriation of some human remains from Missouri. And after about a year and a half, we won our case against the Smithsonian, and now I work for them. So figure that one out. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about our facility and how this relates to repatriation and traditional care and moving beyond repatriation in the next 5 years or so. This is our brand new facility in Suitland, Maryland. This is the Cultural Resources Center for the National Museum of the American Indian. This is the new facility that houses our collections and is a resource center for the general public and for the tribal constituencies that we have partnerships with. And it's a beautiful building. If you get a chance to come see us sometime, I think is it every other Friday we're open to the public? At this point, until we get all the collections down. We have an older facility in New York, and we're in the process of moving those collections to this new facility, and it's a great place to go to every day, and I'll explain why. I'm out of focus too, so I don't know if this is in focus or not. There we go. This is the entryway to our facility at the Cultural Resources Center, and when the concept was being kicked around for this building, we wanted to do something different, and 40 American Indian designers and architects came together to come up with the design for this building, and we wanted to do something that was in contrast to most museums that you go into, where it's kind of especially for a Native person, it's dark, it's unfriendly, there's no orientation to the outside, and so in this building incorporates a lot of natural materials, daylight, which is the enemy of most collections, but it's designed in a way so that the light won't damage the collections. and really goes to some of the philosophies that Native people have with connection to the environment and so forth. Oops. This is a top view of our facility, and there are Native peoples in the area that have been in the area for thousands of years, and we wanted to honor the people that live in the area along the Potomac River. And this is actually the design of the building is a nautilus shape or a seashell shape, which is an important icon to the Piscataway people along the Potomac. And so you can't really see it from the road. I think most people think it's a sports complex or something as they're driving down the street, but from if you're flying overhead, you can see the shape of the building. It's quite an interesting design. And what's nice about our facility is we're incorporated into what's called the Suitland Parkway, which is a green area of federal land. And so we have some nice private spaces in the woods behind our building. And this is an interior shot of our collections. This is the main level of our collections area. Our collections area encompasses close to 50,000 square feet, and these storage containers are about 12 feet tall. It's compact, automated compact storage. And we have close to 800,000 objects in our collection that are going to be housed in this facility, representing cultures from all over the Western Hemisphere, not just the United States. And here's we're moving collections into the facility. This is some of the first batch of items that come down. We move about anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 objects a week that come in on a truck. And it's estimated it'll take until about 2004 to finish the entire move process. And what's nice about this facility is that there are certain things in the building that have been incorporated that make it more comfortable for Native people. And we have an indoor ceremonial space and an outdoor ceremonial space. And this is part of our indoor ceremonial space. And people from different tribal communities have different ways of either purifying themselves or cleansing their thoughts or cleansing themselves spiritually and cleansing objects. And so we provide different kinds of materials for people to have access to when they come into our facility. And people can, very unique in the museum world, we allow our visitors to actually bring objects from inside the museum outside and to use them ceremonially if need be, or to cleanse them. And staff also uses this outdoor space if they need time alone. We have Native and non-Native staff, people from different cultural and religious backgrounds, so people have an opportunity to use this space. And this is our indoor ceremonial space. What's unique about this room is that we actually allow an open flame within the building, which is pretty rare in the museum world as well. But we have super strength ventilation system that takes the smoke directly outside up to the heavens and so forth. So if it's a cold day or a rainy day, or people need to be inside for whatever reason, we can accommodate people. Now, Terry and I, and I have a staff of 5 people in the repatriation office. We're charged with handling all claims that come in for ceremonial items, sacred items, objects of cultural patrimony, but we're also charged with the return of all human remains and funerary objects within our museum. And our board of directors have given us a mandate, and really we all share this philosophy that we are to repatriate all human remains and associated funerary objects that we have in our possession by the end of 2004. And we feel that we can't have the kinds of partnerships and relationships with communities if we have the remains of their ancestors in our museum. So we're working quickly, methodically, to return all of the human remains that we have, and it's not an easy task, and not every tribe is ready to receive human remains, but we're not waiting for the tribes to come to us. We're actually going to the communities with our inventories and information and providing that information to the tribes, and then giving them an opportunity to prepare themselves to receive the human remains. And this is a group from Alaska, from the village of Angoon. And they came to our facility to document collections from their village, and also we went through a process to repatriate this dagger that this gentleman, second from the end here, is holding. And a lot of people don't understand the histories and the hardships that tribes have gone through over the years. In this particular case, the United States Navy had a ship in the Inside Passage of Alaska in the 1890s, and for whatever reason decided to take target practice on the village of Angoon in the middle of the night, and destroyed the village and killed many of the inhabitants in the village, came ashore and looted the village of many ceremonial objects, and eventually the people that the shipmen sold these objects to various collectors and so forth, and ended up in our collections over time. And so when these folks came to our museum, they knew about the dagger, but they didn't realize that we had other objects from their village, and so they were very excited, and they documented the objects that we had. And we've, since this time, this was a few years ago, and since that time we've actually returned several more objects from the village of Angoon. And here, this is interesting, the headdresses and the hats that they're wearing were actually from our collections, and they performed a ceremony to receive this object, this dagger that we repatriated, and asked to wear the objects from their community. And that was unusual for us. This doesn't always happen in the museum setting, but I think it really hit home to staff that we see hundreds and even thousands of objects every day that have been removed from their cultural context, and we don't really understand the full meaning of these objects. But when these folks came into our museum, these objects came alive again because they were reconnected with the cultural context, and it was very exciting for staff to see that, and I think it made a lot of people realize why we're here and doing what we're doing at the National Museum of the American Indian. And here's another consultation we had with Southern Cheyenne, Gordon Yellowman, with some of our employees, and we know certain things about the collection, but it's important for the tribes to come in and view the collections, and we certainly learn much more about what we have by our interaction with the tribes. And through our interaction, we get information about the long-term care of collections. Not everything that we have in our museum falls within the repatriation guidelines, and a very small percentage of our collections will ever be repatriated, and we estimate roughly 1% or less than 1% what falls within the guidelines for repatriation. So it's important to us, and also important to the Native communities, that we have some kind of long-term strategy for the care of collections, and we call this traditional care. And we don't always care for objects verbatim as to what the tribes tell us. We have institutional practices for the care of collections, but what we're trying to do is trying to find the balance between tribal concerns and our institutional practices, and that's what we call traditional care, somewhere where we're both comfortable with the way we care for these collections. Here's another example, another tribe coming in to document collections that we have in our facility, and talking about the long-term care, the fact that these objects may not go back through repatriation. In some instances, we've actually repatriated objects, but the tribe has asked us to care for them. So they legally own the objects, but they're in our possession for long-term care. And this is happening more and more, where people within the tribal communities may not be indoctrinated to care for objects in the traditional way. And so until they're ready to receive these objects, they've asked us to care for them. And I'm going to finish up talking about one issue the issue of pesticides. In the NAGPRA legislation, there's a section 10E, and it talks about disclosure of chemicals that were pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, and so forth that have been used on objects to preserve them over time. And no museum up until the latter half of the 20th century ever realized that they would be sending objects back to tribal communities. That they thought, the first part of the 20th century, I think most museums felt that there would no longer be American Indian communities by the end of the 20th century. So there was a massive effort to collect as many objects as possible and to preserve them. And to preserve them, they used different kinds of pesticides, and including arsenic, mercuric chloride, compounds using lead, DDT, and probably 120 other kinds of chemicals over the years. So now, through repatriation, we're reintroducing these objects back into these communities, and they've been treated with chemicals that are very hazardous to the tribal populations. And so what is the museum's responsibility now? And we're just now trying to answer some of those questions. But in our case, we're trying to be proactive about it. We're trying to disclose as much information to the tribes as we can concerning objects that are going to go back into their communities. And so we work with, we're fortunate we have an industrial hygienist that works for the Smithsonian, and we work closely with her and also the tribes. It's important for us to understand how these objects are going to be used and how they're going to be stored in order to give the tribes the right kind of information they need for the care and storage of their sacred items, and also to protect individuals within the tribe from becoming harmed from exposure to these items. And we're mostly concerned with things that cover the face, something that people would breathe into, pipes, flutes, and so forth. And so this is an example of our partnership that we have. This is a member of the Crow tribe right here, and he's consulting with our industrial hygienist about the use of this particular item that we were planning on repatriating. And so it's important for them to know how we're going to conduct our tests and what the results may be from those tests, but also the tribe to tell us how the object is going to be used and to come up with a strategy for the care of this particular object. And so here, this particular gentleman is explaining the history of this object and how it's going to be used, and consulting with other members of his tribe in his language, and then consulting with our staff about the testing of the object. And we're using different kinds of testing methods here. The unit that our industrial hygienist is using is called a Jerome unit, and it detects mercury or mercuric chloride vapors in enclosed areas, and it gives us an instant reading whether it's positive or negative. And in this particular case, it was negative. So, and then Terry's helping out with this project here. And then we're taking surface samples to test for arsenic. And I'm happy to report that in this particular case, our results came back negative. But if they do come back positive, then we go through another series of tests to determine the amount of pesticides that were used, and then compare that to EPA standards to find out if it's safe or not. And most tribes are conservative about the use of these objects that have been treated. And here we're preparing samples to be sent off to the lab here. I think that's it. But there's so much to talk about. I know we don't have much time, and that's just one small aspect of what we do and for the long-term care of collections, and we'll hope to answer your questions later. Thank you.
You're up next. I'm up next. Okay. You're the guy. Thank you, Jim. Our next speaker is Pete Jemison, who's from the Seneca Nation and currently, and has been for a number of years, the historic site manager for Gadanandan State Historic Site, which is an historic village of the Seneca people. So Pete is also involved in present day and history at this very same moment. He's also a published author, and he's contributed to books such as Words That Come Before All Else, Native Americans and archaeologists, and Mary Jemison, a white woman of the Seneca. He's also a well-known and respected artist and has been featured in many, many exhibitions over the years. Most recently, he's been featured in Native Artist, the Forum for Contemporary Fine Art, and an article by Larry Abbott called Painter Peter Jemison Seneca. And we have a lot of relationships with Pete in terms of many of the things that both Terry and Jim have brought up. And Pete's been working on these very same issues long before there was a NAGPRA. Pete. Thank you.
Nyaweskano kagwego. Winichio nangan winisade. Onondo waga ni. Kanonza death down ni gyaso. Kanonda gan ni kanonge. And my language, which is the language of the people who call themselves Ononda Waka, I give thanks that each and every one of you are well. And I bring greetings from the people that are called the Seneca. From the Seneca Nation of Indians, I bring greetings to each and every one of you. I belong to the clan known as the Great Blue Heron Clan. In the Seneca Nation, we are, each of us, members of one of 8 clans that make up our nation. And I belong on the bird side of this clan system to the Great Blue Heron Clan. And from that clan I take a name, and my name is Ganonza Death Down. And as Bruce mentioned, I manage a 17th century historic site known as Ganondagan, and it's the site of the capital of the Seneca Nation between about 1655 and 1687. For 10 years I was the chairman of a committee called the Haudenosaunee Standing Committee on Burial Rules and Regulations, and the Haudenosaunee are known to others as the Iroquois Confederacy. And so we are made up of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora nations. And our people in general live within the state of New York. But there are Seneca, Cayuga in Oklahoma, there are Mohawk people living in Ontario and in Quebec, and the Six Nations Reserve, where all 6 nations reside, is also in Ohsweken, Ontario. As has been mentioned, I have been involved with repatriation long before NAGPRA was passed and since its passage. And I guess for me, I trace it back to 1976, the first time I visited a museum when a crate was being opened that had not been opened for more than 20 years. And inside of this crate were what we call Sagajowe, Gowa, and Gujisa. And these are, the translation we might use would be grandfathers. These are our helpers, sacred medicine masks. And they had been in this crate for more than 20 years. And so on the occasion of this crate being opened, I was invited by one of the elders with whom I worked at the time to accompany them and to learn firsthand what was in the crate and what the possible disposition would be of some of the things in there. And so without consciously realizing at the time, of course, where that path would lead, eventually I would become the chairman of the committee that would deal with repatriation when the law passed, and would begin first by working on protection of our burial sites in the state of New York. As of this moment, we have no law in the state of New York to protect unmarked burial sites, and this represents a major problem that we still deal with on if not a daily basis, at least a weekly basis. The first repatriation we did from the National Museum of the American Indian was human remains, and we brought those home first, and it's been told to us that if we take care of them first, that all of the other things that are a part of the NAGPRA legislation will follow. And so we consequently then took care of the repatriation of wampum. Wampum is made from quahog clamshell and sometimes periwinkle shell, and wampum for us is not money, but it's a mnemonic device for recording important agreements, treaties, and the like, and also for people to carry a message, to convey to those who receive the wampum from the carrier that indeed it's a true message that they're carrying and that they have been delegated as the person to carry that message. And so we began repatriating wampum in about 1988, again prior to the passage of NAGPRA, and we repatriated both wampum belts and wampum strings from the National Museum of the American Indian. But in 1998, we repatriated again our grandfathers from NMAI, and in fact, we repatriated 455 of our medicine masks from the museum. And looking back on this time period, according to my memory, and which isn't always reliable, approximately a month to 2 months before the repatriation took place, we began to get some inkling that there might be contamination. And a random sampling, a very small sampling, was done on about 6 objects, and of those 6, I think 1 produced a positive result for arsenic. And we were right on the verge of repatriation, and we had this very difficult choice, whether to proceed with repatriation of these, not knowing fully what the story was on contamination, or to allow them to be moved to Suitland, Maryland, and then, first crated, then uncrated, and then going through the process which we had been working on for a number of years to get them home, or to take them at the opportunity that we had. And there was a feeling among some of the members of the committee that in fact there were some obstacles being placed before us, that whether it was intentional or not, there was the perception that actually they didn't want to return to us, and so people said, we're going to take them back now while we have the opportunity. And so during the packing, we asked them to do a random sampling of as many as they could. And as it turns out, they sampled 57 of those sacred masks at the time, and 7% of them came back with a positive reading for arsenic. And as coincidences would have it, we did not learn that fact of the extent of the contamination or the number from that random sampling until the day they repatriated them to our community, the day that they arrived in our community. And I'm not placing blame here because we're long past that, but what we then were faced with was a poisoning of the sacred, and my job as chairman became the hot seat, because I stood in front of literally a few hundred of my people and had to explain to them that this joy that we felt in bringing home our grandfathers was overshadowed by the knowledge that we had indeed contaminated objects that posed a threat to human health, and that we had more questions than answers. And this is 1998, November of 98, and at that time there were really not the people that we could turn to get the answers. There's a different dialogue today. There's a dialogue that has been talked about here where the chemists and the physicians and the museum people and our people are talking to each other. But that dialogue was quite different in 1998, and that's not that long ago. Just very recently, we repatriated 143 human remains from the Rochester Museum and Science Center, in fact, in March of this year. So the work goes on, and that process took 5 years. I think one of the things that few people appreciate is how much work goes into each and every repatriation. People assume that this is something that takes place in a matter of months, or I don't know what they may think, but this is a case here, just one example, that took 5 years, but literally the dialogue for that return I started when I was doing graduate work at the University of Buffalo by holding a symposium involving the RMSC and our traditional people, and that was in 1989, on the eve of the passage of NAGPRA. And so the dialogue really began then, and it took until 2001 for the actual return to occur. And we're still working because there are more remains in their possession, and we're still being confronted with contention. A contentious atmosphere, really, in which some people believe that we should not be entitled to certain remains because the entire onus is on the community, is on the nation. Whenever we repatriate anything from a museum, we must prove that they're ours. The museum, by right of possession, I hear a different dialogue here saying, that they're the caretakers. But there are many museums who take the position that those are their possessions and that we have to prove they're ours, and that's the nature of the law. And so this point of proof proving it to the legal councils of these institutions, to the board of directors, to the collections committee, to the director of the museum, to the whoever, is a very long process, and it's one I've been intimately involved in. I'm not exaggerating about the work that goes on in doing this and the frustration that you can encounter. If there's anything I've learned in this experience, it's certainly patience. And I think the other thing that people seldom, and I think Jim and Terry have tried to describe this, is that we view these as living, as that they were given a responsibility, that they are a force that has been in the universe since the beginning of time, that this particular force has been given for our use, and that we are the only ones who can take care of them. That others may have them in their possession, but they can never care for them. They can only, hold them. We are the only ones who can take care of them. We're the only ones who know the songs. We are the only ones who know the words that go with these. We're the only ones who conduct the ceremonies that literally feed and take care of these. And I think if anything I would want to share with this group is unless you believe, then you never will experience its power. You will never understand its power. And that I understand. And that they have shown me every time that I needed to know that I was doing the job because it was intended that I do the job. My community selected me as the chairman, but my grandfather selected me apparently long before that, and I didn't know it. But over time, they've shown me what to do and how to do it. So when I go back to the human remains issue, and what we're dealing with here is, we're dealing with it with a mindset, which is that up until the latter half of the 90s, as I think Jim said and as Terry has said, basically people were defining who we are. People were writing in books, and people were putting up text in museums and defining who we are. And since that time period, there's been an exchange taking place in which essentially we're telling them what they don't know, and we're learning from them how much they don't know. Now, I'm one of those people who isn't particularly, I don't know, politically correct at times, I suppose. And, it's kind of ironic, in the face of the Washington Redskins and things like that. But here's a typical example, okay? Archaeology has established a certain time frame within which we must fit. And, there's this notion that we arrived here over the polar ice gap in 12,500 or something like that. And then, we came into existence, meaning Haudenosaunee people came into existence about 1,000 years ago. And before that, I don't know where we were. I like to ask that question. Where were we on 9/99 at 11:45 p.m. just before we became Haudenosaunee people? Because if you accept the prevailing notion, that's when we came into existence. And I'm trying to rile you up out there, and they know I'm good at this. That's what I do. So I contend that that's not true, that we've been here since the beginning of time, and that we didn't come over the polar gap. There might have been some people who did, but I believe that people were here. I'm talking about an American genesis, and I'm convinced that that's true because of our stories. And the whole issue here revolves around the validity or the lack of validity of oral tradition. And I'm here to maintain that our oral tradition is a valid way of knowing. Just as your books are valid to you, and just as your archaeology is valid to you, and just as your research is valid to you, our way of knowing, which is our oral tradition, Ongwe Ka, our Indian way of life, is valid. And it validates our belief, and is a true reflection of our cultural tradition. And I'm going to give you a brief example here. I'm going to actually try to stay within the 5-minute time period, which would be a miracle for me. Last summer, we held an elders gathering. And an elders gathering, what we do is we bring together 50 young people, all of whom are Haudenosaunee, between the ages of 12 and 18 years of age. And we bring together with them, with traditional elders, people who are the recognized people who carry out our ceremonial way of life, who maintain our language, who do whatever they do in our communities to come and share Ongwe Ongwe Ka with these young people for a period of 4 days. They stay with us. They get up at 5:30 in the morning and do a sunrise ceremony, and they take care of all of the elements of that camp all the day long, and they are required to sit through 3 hours of intensive training and knowledge sharing to understand who they are. It's a brief introduction in 4 days, but they get 12 hours of this, along with recreational activities, along with traditional foods, and along with other experiences that they have in meeting their own kind and other people. But in that process, this past summer, what we did was we brought together our young people with an actual wampum belt that was repatriated from the New York State Museum that people refer to as the Hiawatha Belt. We call it the Five Nations Belt. Some of you may be familiar with it. I'm sorry about not bringing any visuals with you, but some of the things I'm talking about I cannot illustrate with slides. So this Hiawatha Belt was present, the real deal. This belt of, an indeterminate age. And we realized that some of the full story of this belt cannot be told. And the reason it can't be told is because in the time period when this belt was away from our community, we lost people who had more of a knowledge of that belt than those who are left today. And so we have a part of the story, but we don't have the complete story we might have had if it had come back, let's say, about 6 years before 1988. If it had come back then, there were certain people alive at that time who could have given even more resonance to it. But what we did was, we were trying to explain to these young people what it means. And so we realized that the only way to do that was to create a Grand Council. Our Grand Council of Chiefs meets at the Onondaga Nation, and we have 50 chiefs that make up that Grand Council. And so we took those young people and we assigned them to the nations that they came from. If they were Senecas, they sat with the Senecas. If they were Mohawk, they sat with the Mohawk. If they were Tuscarora, they sat there. And if they were Onondaga, they sat there with those people. And then the women are separated in this case from the men in that council. But they have a responsibility, and I'll try to come to that quickly. And so in the process of showing them how we make decisions, how we arrive at consensus, how the idea is brought into the council, where it originates from, and how it passes back and forth across the fire between the elder brothers and the younger brothers, and how it goes back through the keepers of the central fire, the Onondaga Nation, and that whole process of moving one idea, and of how you, within your group, maybe it's the Seneca, how you arrive at consensus there, and how everybody's opinion in that regard is important. And by physically doing this, we made that belt come to life, in my view. And not only, did we put back into it what we knew, but it then began to share with us what it embodied as a record of the Five Nations and of the forming of our confederacy under the message of peace, power, and righteousness. And so for those 12 and 18-year-olds, those 50 young people, and for all the people who were present there that day, it was, an incredible experience. We brought together people who knew how to weave wampum belts. We brought together people who knew how to read the facsimiles that we had with us. We brought together the people who speak their language, because when that transaction is taking place between the Onondaga and the Seneca and the Mohawk and the Seneca, it has to be done in our language. So we had to speak our language. And we have to then explain to those who don't understand exactly what's taking place. And so in that process, we teased out of that belt some of its message that we did not have completely. But in using it, and this is the important thing, why repatriation? Because that's what brings back to our community the help that we need after all the experiences that we have been through before this time period to bring us to this point in time, through the loss you know, and to share the laughter, to share the energy of the young people with the elders, and to show them that those elders the kind of respect that they're due, and for our young people to learn that these people carry around a tremendous body of knowledge that they can share with them, and to understand again who they are, to help them in their journey that they're going to carry on, and to help them remember one day, sometime in the future, I was present the day that the Five Nations Belt came to Ganondagan, and I was present there the day we talked about it, and this is what I remember about that experience, because they too will become a part of the building in the future of that understanding for all of our people. When I think back to a question that Bruce raised, and I'll close with this, is the responsibility of the museum. What is the responsibility of the museum? Certainly the responsibility with regard to contamination is to be forthright and to disclose all that you know. And as you learn more, to continue to disclose that to those people who are most directly affected by the issues of contamination. And we're still, in our communities, yesterday, literally, I sat with a leader from one of our communities and discussed with him the additional testing that needs to take place in his community and what I would advise him to do at this point in time. That conversation took place at my kitchen table yesterday. So we are, even though it took, the return took place in '98, it's still an issue, it's still something we're dealing with, based on new knowledge that is coming to us. But again, going back to the museum's responsibilities, we walk into the museum at times and in places, and I've walked into the Heard Museum and I've seen it, and I've walked into, you name it, and I've seen it up on the wall, a map. And this map purports to describe the arrival of us into the new world, quote unquote, a world more ancient than any world known in Europe, I believe. And when we see that map, it is like right away, you know, we are thinking to ourselves, where do we start? Where do we start to make this bridge from the world at which we come from and to the world that you know, so that we will arrive at a language and we'll arrive at an understanding of one another which is mutually respectful? And it's a very difficult road. And it's a road that has not really fully been mapped by anybody. And we're still going through the bumps in the road. We're still going through the difficulties of that dialogue that brings two very different cultures together over an issue that is common to us all at the moment. I thank you for listening. Daneho.
Thank you, Pete. I just have to comment just that I think he's spoken so clearly about that mutual partnership, and that we're on the same road in terms of, he's obviously pointed out things about the return of objects, and we're all moving forward into areas we don't know anything about, yet we continue on. And the very fact that we're here together demonstrates parts of that partnership that's ongoing between the museum and the community, and the ongoing responsibilities. Now, does everyone want to stand up for a second? We have one last speaker, but certainly not least, thank you. Okay. Everyone adjust themselves, we'll be okay. Rubie Watson is the William and Mariel Seabury Howells Director of the Peabody Museum and Senior Lecturer in Anthropology at Harvard University. And before coming to Harvard in 1992, she was the Associate Professor of Anthropology and Associate Director of Asian Studies Program at the University of Pittsburgh. And she earned her PhD in Anthropology from the London School of Economics, University of London in 1982. And she has received many awards, fellowships, and grants from the Getty Foundation, Wenner-Gren Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Science Foundation, and the Crest Foundation. Rubie?
Thank you, Bruce. And good evening to everyone. I'm going to try to be practical, which I sometimes find somewhat difficult, but I will try to be practical on this occasion. I want to just give you a little bit of background about the Peabody Museum and where it stands, where it has come from with regard to repatriation and sort of where it stands now, and some hopes about where we would like to be in the future. The Peabody has, we believe, the Peabody here at Harvard, has, we believe, the largest collections to fall under the NAGPRA mandate. As you know, the Smithsonian does not fall under the NAGPRA legislation, but legislation very like NAGPRA, in some ways perhaps almost a duplicate of NAGPRA, very similar, covers the Smithsonian. So we have been worked with more than 350 federally recognized tribes, 8 Hawaiian organizations, and 235 Alaskan villages and corporations over the last 10 years and more. The collections at the Peabody, because the Peabody is the oldest museum of anthropology in the Western Hemisphere, really cover the entire United States. So we're not a regional museum. That is, our collections do not just come from New England, they come from all over the United States, and that in some ways makes life a little more complicated on the practical side for the Peabody than it does for some other museums who also have large collections. NAGPRA has established at least, I mean really there are more than this, but I'll focus on these, 2 important discussions, shall we say. I would say that in the United States generally, there is more attention, NAGPRA has brought more attention to Native American past, Native American concerns, Native American issues than existed pre-NAGPRA, and that it has allowed for and encouraged and that it has allowed for and encouraged enhanced understandings of these issues. It has also, and this is a somewhat more parochial interest, it has accelerated discussions between Native Americans and museums of all kinds. These discussions, it probably will not surprise you, have not always been easy or comfortable. But talking, at least in my view, is better than not talking. A better understanding in museums really, I think, is focused on, in some part, Native American, that is, museums have, because of NAGPRA, a better understanding, although perhaps not a perfect one, a better understanding regarding Native American concerns about collections in their museums. Now, you may think that this is not anything astonishing, and didn't they always have this understanding? Well, I think that, unfortunately, that wasn't always the case, and that the discussions that are taking place have helped museums to appreciate, to the degree that they can, Native American concerns about the collections that exist in their storage areas, their exhibit halls, their classrooms, their laboratories. And this is, of course, an enormous topic. It's also led, and this is really quite obvious, at another level it's not so obvious, to a process by which repatriation is possible. I would say that in some ways NAGPRA has established, defined situations in which local interests, local knowledge has preeminence over what sometimes in the museum world we refer to as the public interest. It has, in the law, established this for the United States And there are many people who may disagree about some of the aspects of this or the extent to which these definitions, who disagree with these definitions. But I think that that's what the law has done, and that's what laws do. And I think that that's important to grasp, although it seems sort of self-evident. The Peabody Museum will complete its inventories of human remains and funerary objects in May 2001, so in about a month. We're proud of our record. We believe, and we have been told by people outside the museum, that our consultation process has been exemplary. The Peabody Museum established a process that was different than a lot of other museums, in which the museum said to itself and to other people that consultation and inventories should take place at the same time. This slowed the process of inventories greatly, because we were inviting in, trying to find funds for, this is another problem that may come up in later discussions, for Native Americans, for tribal representatives to come into the museum and consult with us. It doesn't mean we always agreed, but to consult with us as we did the inventories. At some point, the Interior Department spoke to us and said, we want the inventories. The inventories are important, and they must be given priority. And their reasoning makes a lot of sense. Their reasoning was that Native Americans are waiting for these inventories. They have many issues, healthcare, education, all kinds of issues that are of concern to them. They need this information from museums to plot strategies, to allocate resources. And so we need those inventories. It meant that our consultation process changed drastically, and it was somewhat diminished by this process. We were given a deadline. We were told that we had to finish the inventories by May 31st, 2001. We will achieve that. And I think that that's important. And I know that that's important to Native Americans to have the kind of information that the Peabody has, basic information about these collections available to them. Contacts between the Peabody Museum and Native American representatives and ordinary Native Americans who come and visit the museum have led to, and I'll just list a few things, I think some attention, have focused some attention on the museum to discussions about exhibits, items that people believe, Native Americans believe, should not be on exhibit, that were on exhibit at the Peabody. We, through the NAGPRA process, and through processes that came out of NAGPRA, have been able to talk, I think, I hope fairly intelligently on the part of the museum to Native Americans about this. We have accommodated these requests to the degree that we can. Storage conditions, and you've heard a lot about storage conditions. This is a big issue. Museums not only need to say that they respect the collections that are in their charge, but they need to show that they respect these collections. The collections which may be temporarily housed in these museums, but they need to be able to show this, and this is very important. And I really see that that's what, in part, this question about storage conditions are about. Offerings. The Peabody Museum for some time has made has accommodated requests to commemorate, to memorialize, to make offerings. There are many vocabularies that we can use here, to human remains, to ancestors, and to the artifacts, the objects which these people, these ancestors created. This has not been easy for practical, and now I get to practice here. This is not always easy. You've seen the beautiful facility in Suitland. Well, the Peabody Museum was built in 1877. We don't have much space. It's very difficult to find a proper space, a respectful space that allows people to do what they want to do. And there are, a number of conservation issues and things like that. The important thing is that this is being discussed. openly and I hope respectfully between museums and Native Americans. Collaboration, we heard about consultation, collaboration, and partnership. I believe that there is now a discussion that's going on, which I think is very important with regard to collaboration and research, and discussions with Native Americans about research and about the importance of research, the limitations of research. When research, there is secrecy. This whole question of secrecy is very important. When should secrecy be respected? And that has to be something that doesn't just take place between museums and museum professionals and Native Americans. That's something that that archaeologists are thinking about, that anthropologists are thinking about, that art historians, that people in religious studies, that many, many people are thinking about and need to think about. One of the things that we found, I think at one point, we perhaps felt that, well, we're going to talk to Native Americans and we are going to find a way, there is a way of dealing, there's one way of dealing with Native American objects in storage that are sacred, that are culturally sensitive, that have religious significance, that have spiritual significance. And we're going to sort of understand what that is, and then we're going to know how to deal with this. Well, there is no one way. This is something that one has to talk to each group as they come into the museum and elicit their views and their requests and their desires. And we have to then be able to say, this is what we think we can do, this is what we'd like to do, this is what we can do now. But there is no, each group has different views about this, and they have to be listened to. So there's no simple solution to this. The Peabody Museum is a university research museum. And I believe that university research museums have special things to offer in the museum world, and they have special obligations. And I think that part of that, of course, relates to questions of access, and we struggle with this and struggle with questions of secrecy and local knowledge and scientific knowledge and other kinds of knowledges. But down to the sort of practical level, I think that a museum like the Peabody really has, that we're looking for mechanisms to make what many of the people here on the panel have been talking about and Bruce Bernstein started out with. We're looking for ways to make collaboration and partnership real. And how do we do that? And I will just list a few ways that I think are important. And they're all, I think they're all quite practical. Internships, making internships available to Native Americans and to young people who are interested in a museum field, who want to make a career in museums, making it opportunities for them to really get not only theoretical abstract book knowledge about the museum world, but to get knowledge in the museums themselves. Traveling fellowships. I would love to provide, and we're just struggling to find some resources to do this, and we've started to do this in a few cases, providing funds for Native American artists to be able to come, and there are many who wish to come and utilize collections like the Peabody in their own work. And often people don't want to be away from their communities. They don't want to be away from their studios. They may want to spend 3 days. They may want to spend 5. They may want to spend 10 days. They don't want to spend large amounts of time. But finding opportunities for them to come and utilize these collections, and to, of course, impart, provide their knowledge, their understandings to make these collections and these objects live in the way that I think we all want them to do. Research collaboration. We are experimenting with a research project with the Museum of Northern Arizona, the Hopi tribe, a Hopi linguist and a group of Hopi elders, and the Peabody Museum on a Wadavee, an excavation that was done at a Wadavee in the 1930s, looking at murals, very rare and very beautiful murals, and pottery traditions, and having art historians, anthropologists, linguists, Hopi religious leaders look at this material. Part of what is being collected in this research effort will remain with the Hopi and will not be available to the researchers who are part of the project. So this is, back to this issue of respect, and I'm not sure that secrecy is the right word, but respect for people's knowledge. Co-curation, this has been discussed. I don't know that anybody's used that word, but co-curation of objects, management of objects in collections, in which one is really involving Native Americans in how objects are being housed, how objects are being exhibited, how objects are being researched. I think that really, to me, as a museum director, the very most important thing is to make the Peabody Museum collections accessible, and is to try to make the Peabody a welcoming place for all kinds of people. And also to make the collections available, and that is much more difficult than you might think it is when you have 8 million objects. One of the things that we're trying to do is make collections available on the web. Now, I do not believe that the web is the answer to everything, and it's not going to satisfy researchers. It's not going to satisfy many Native Americans, but it is the entree. It is an inexpensive way for a student here at Harvard, a Native American living in a pueblo in the Southwest, a researcher in Hamburg, Germany, to be able to have a first look and to be able to see what museum resources, what resources there are at the Peabody that they might tap into, which aren't quite as plentiful as one would like them to be. All right. To me, these mechanisms are, I call them mechanisms, internships, traveling fellowships, the web, co-curation, that these are what give meaning, give significance, give reality to collaboration and partnerships. And it are those mechanisms that really museum people have to think about, have to talk to Native Americans about, what do they think is useful, what do they think is interesting, what do they want to do. But life has to be breathed into these partnerships. And the National Museum of the American Indian is doing a fantastic job. But they have resources that most museums don't. And we have to tailor, each museum, big, small, large, public, private, has to tailor their resources, has to fit their resources to meet this challenge. And that, of course, is the biggest challenge of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rubie. That was a very good summation. I know it's late, but I really would like to field some questions and have the benefit of the people that are here. It's very clear, and Rubie has done a very nice job in summing up that there's an entire new and emerging vocabulary. I mean, there's lots that is going on about that. And I think that it's very clear, too, that there are inroads into the day-to-day of museum work that has come out of NAGPRA. And I guess I still ask the question, I understand the inroads and I can see them and feel them every day in the museum, but I really wonder, is it enough yet? I guess is always my question, and I think some of our panelists have addressed that as well. I think that for NMAI, that repatriation for us is unremarkable. Now, what I mean by unremarkable is that it's part of our day-to-day work. And I think that's a very important way that we think about it. It's still very important. It still needs to go on. I think that we've heard a lot about ascendancy of Native voice and the inclusion at all levels, and the inclusion in advisory boards and staff and interns is also very, very important. I think that we need to think about how we construct our work. I know in New Mexico, before I was, as Rubie has said, we do have great resources at NMAI, and I fully realize that. And coming out of New Mexico, where every dollar was hard fought. We constructed our inventories for the 1995 reporting in NAGPRA with Native people first. Where does the discussion start? Where does the dialogue start? Can you start the dialogue from the very first time you sit down? And when we sat down to have the dialogue, the first thing we talked about is we really don't know what we're going to do. We know that the community doesn't really know what they're going to do. And we started from that place of mutual understanding, however vague that might have been, and constructed then an inventory process that served the Native communities, and I mean literally that the inventory sheets served the types of information that they wanted on those inventories. And that's the sort of way we need to keep thinking about museums. I will say that with the really deep resources of the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian, comes an obligation. And we are fully cognizant of that obligation, not only to do things right, to try new things, to forge new ground, to try and listen to all comers, but also the scrutiny that provides for us. We're very well aware of that. And looking always for new ways. And I think that's one of the reasons why we stand up and try and talk about what we're doing so much. Those are just some of the thoughts I had sitting here. I was just wondering now, in terms of people's attention, if you could ask questions, if you had specific questions, maybe for one of the panelists. Yes, ma'am. Oh, and a microphone for you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for an excellent panel. I mean, so important and so engaging. Thank you. My question is directed primarily to Jim Pepper Henry, but not exclusively. I was very struck by your comment about some communities not feeling that they were ready to take back these spiritual objects, and that you said that they went away and sort of and prepared themselves. Now, could you say a little bit more about how they did that? What was entailed? How did they self-educate, or how did they get themselves to a state when they felt that they could take back these objects into their fold? And secondly, this is really just a quick comment or question/observation. Again, I was intrigued by your slide of the entrance hall and the light, your emphasis upon the light and the importance of the light. I wonder how many of you have been to the National Museum of African Art, which is almost totally devoid of light, which is actually underground. Now, some people love that because they think that reflects African connectedness to the earth. But some people hate it, like this is just further repression of native peoples, like putting them underground. Thank you.
All right. I'll give you an example, answer your first question, that some tribes may not be ready or prepared to receive objects. I'll give you a couple examples. One is, in the case of human remains, many tribes have never had to deal with repatriation of remains before, and they don't have ceremonies to rebury remains. The remains were buried once with a ceremony, and no American Indian tribe ever thought that somebody would come along and dig up the remains for any reason. And so there are tribes out there that they haven't developed any system or any tradition to receive remains, prepare themselves for that, and reinter them. Another example is I was an intern at the National Museum of the American Indian in 1995, and part of my internship project was to study some of the collections from my tribe. And during my studies, I discovered that my own grandfather had a bundle in the collections that once belonged to him, and some other people in the tribe had relatives who were associated with some bundles in the museum. And so kind of a personal experience about trying to have things returned back to the community. These are definitely objects that are very sacred to my tribe, but there isn't anybody in the tribe at this time who either has the knowledge to care for these in the proper way, and that can involve many things. Having a feast for these objects, and it takes a certain amount of wealth to do that too, but also to care for them in a respectful way, and even to use them at some point. And in my tribe, in order to take on that responsibility, not only do you have to have the knowledge, but you have to be of a certain age, and there just isn't anybody around now that's of age. And I've got about 16 or 17 years to go before I even get close to being of that age where I could care for this bundle that belonged to my family. So that's just an example of how some tribes may not be ready to receive that. And there are many more examples, but those are some ones that are personal.
Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add a little bit what Jim is talking about from the Pueblo world, from the tables and carrots that I talked about in repatriating the human remains. The Pueblos didn't have anything to do with touching the remains, due to the fact that those excavations to the human remains were done by Park Service people themselves. What they told us is that you excavated them, you buried them back. But the park took that into a positive and say, yes, we take that responsibility, and we will do it for you. And I was part of that reburial as a supervisor, and the superintendent did the reburial, and the tribe that we've been consulting with had no problem with that. The other fact is that Pueblo people, like other tribes, are very superstitious, because especially when it comes down to maybe even prehistoric collections like we have, is that we don't know what kind of people, I mean, we know they're our ancestors, but at the same time, if they were good or bad, or they have other intentions, that they didn't want to be part of that. They didn't want to be close to that. And that's the feeling that some tribes do have. So there are a lot of things that go with that. And so we have to be very careful in how we deal with those, or how we handle certain objects.
I'll give a response from our perspective. There are certain things that were for a specific family or a specific individual, and if that individual is no longer present, and maybe even the members of that family, it's hard to decide, who they are or something like that. Not knowing the specific function of that sacred object that they had, we can't take it back, because it's similar to what he's saying. We don't know what it was made for. We don't know what it was actually created for originally. And so rather than bring something into our community that we could not take care of, we would choose to leave it someplace else.
Can I add to that too? I think also in that sense, it's really about a matter of people arriving at those moments. I guess in terms of coming to realization of what the responsibility is to these things in that sense. I guess I can relate it to another way of saying it in terms of what Jim was talking about with maturity, with a particular kind of woodland practice. You can't ascend into these levels, these upper levels of, without having first accomplished, I guess you could say, knowing how to provide for your family, reaching those levels of maturity, of understanding the whole scope of a life cycle, until you get into those, I guess you could call them autumn years, where you can really ponder those kinds of thoughts. The second part of the question is with respect to the issue of light, is that's just the entryway to our facility, and in our collections areas we do actually have windows that look out, and part of the advisement there from the tribes that we consulted with was that you also have to give these things that are living the same things we all get, which is we're giving them the day as well. as well as the Knights. So it's all-encompassing in that regard. So, done.
I think on the issue of light that we're very much active in having those collections. We try never to use the word storage, for example, because storage is something that's dusty and never used, put aside, to the idea that every object has a life. I think, too, that if you think about museums and responsibility, whether it's a university-based museum for research or a museum like ours, a tribal museum, is that you want people to have access. But you don't want to mitigate too much of the preservation. But if you're just interested in preservation, of course, you could build a room that's very dark and never let anyone into it, probably the best way to preserve things. And I think the other thing that should be very clear from the comments of all the panelists here is that preservation is not just that object. And so the position of that object in the community then, and then the position then of our having that object in the collections is part of that preservation. And it's understanding that role of obligation that we have. The only thing I would add to the comments about the why groups are not ready, and Pete alluded to part of this in his comments, but a man once told me, he said that NAGPRA was really a horrible thing that had happened. This is a native fellow, and he said it's really, he was working with us on NAGPRA issues. He said it's really a horrible thing that's happened to us because the monkey's on our back. We now have to tell you more. In order to get our things back, we now have to tell you even more. And Pete alluded to this in terms of the way that NAGPRA has been written and then is run. And that was my object here in the long road of museum proving its ownership and use and acquisition of that object instead of shortening up that path somehow and looking from the other side. And I think that's a very important thing to remember, that Native people, that one of the unknown factors of the NAGPRA legislation in the last decade was this, because that proverbial truck that everyone talked about that would back up to museums and everything would be loaded onto those trucks and museums would be left with nothing has never happened. And I don't think it will ever happen. I don't think that I think our collections, to that point, our collections are stronger because of except for up there. But our collections are actually stronger. Our Iroquois collections are actually stronger by the relationship and the partnership that we've built with the Haudenosaunee in terms of returning those medicine masks. And that's the sort of posture that I appreciate in the museum where I work takes, and I think that will bring better things for museum, improved programs and interpretation of things that we really need to do.